Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about two of the most popular drugs, nicotine and caffeine. I think these topics are really interesting because they do affect so many of us. We sometimes don't like to think that we may be changing our nervous systems with a substance, but that is precisely what we'll be talking about today. Our textbook and the article that we're going to be reading focus primarily on nicotine, so that's where we're going to spend the most of our time discussing, but we'll also touch on caffeine at the end. I think this is important since so much of us drink caffeine, so it deserves some discussion. All right, starting with nicotine. Nicotine is the psychoactive ingredient in tobacco. It's an alkaloid found in tobacco leaves, so just a really quick background. The large leaf variety, which is pictured here, is called Nicotiana tabacum, and that's what we use for present day tobacco. It originated in South America, where it was domesticated by native peoples more than 5,000 years ago. It was unknown to Europe until Columbus's expedition, and he brought it back. And it was initially scarce in Europe, but popularity grew very rapidly, and it's now the third most widely consumed recreational drug in the world, after caffeine and alcohol. Although most of the toxicity of smoking comes from other chemicals in cigarettes, nicotine is primarily what causes addiction. Tobacco smoking is one of the most persistent and widespread addictions. Smoking cigarettes is the most common way to ingest nicotine, but this picture here shows some other ways. Nicotine is vaporized by burning. It enters the smoker's lungs mainly on tiny tar particles. Once inhaled, it passes through the absorbent surface of the lungs. Nicotine is a weak base, and absorption through the mucous membrane depends on pH. So, nicotine is absorbed to a lesser extent through the membranes of the mouth and nostrils when tobacco is chewed or snorted. Because of this, chewing tobacco, snuff, and nicotine gum are buffered with alkaline pH to facilitate absorption. Smoking is the quickest and the most efficient way of delivering nicotine to the brain. Once it reaches the lungs, it's rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream and moves quickly to the brain. This all takes only about 7 seconds. Besides being quick, the smoking process also allows precise dose titration, so this way the smoker is able to achieve their desired effects. And this picture over here just gives a very brief overview of nicotine being delivered by smoking. It travels to the brain, activates nicotinic receptors, stimulating release of dopamine, causing reward, withdrawal, and desire for another cigarette. But we will go into each of these processes in more detail. An alternative method to is e-cigarettes or vaping, and this is currently very controversial because on like the one hand, should it be encouraged as a safer alternative to cigarette smoking? And on the other hand, it could be discouraged as a potential path to nicotine addiction among young people. This is becoming quite a problem because a lot of young people are starting to vape. Over here, you can see that the amount of e-cigarette use in high school students is now more than tobacco cigarettes. There's a lot of reasons for this, like there's all the like fun fruity flavors, and also there's a perceived lesser danger. I say perceived because there's still a lot of risks associated with vaping. Like in 2019, there was all those mysterious vaping deaths that they thought was due to vitamin E acetate in the lungs. I'm sure most of you are familiar with how they work, but just in case, here's a little diagram. The cartridge right here contains a solution of nicotine dissolved in glycerine, and then this is the battery-powered heating element, which vaporizes nicotine so that it can be inhaled here at the mouthpiece. You can get nicotine in a variety of concentrations. There are even some that have zero nicotine in them that are just for like the aesthetics of smoking. But when you do get nicotine, the actual content is frequently lower than what's stated, and this has been found in a bunch of studies. The nicotine levels that the smoker actually ends up receiving depends on this nicotine concentration in the cartridge and also the rate of puffing and the duration of puffs. It produces rapid delivery like cigarettes, so therefore rapid nicotine-mediated reinforcement, which is why it's presenting such an issue. All right, let's talk about receptors. So Tia covered ACH for me. sorry about that. My audio has been acting up, but Tia covered ACH, so you all should remember that nicotine binds to nicotinic cholinergic receptors. They're ionotropic and they produce a rapid excitatory response in the postsynaptic cell. So let's look over here at the synapse. These little purple triangles are nicotine. They're binding to the nicotine receptors here, which is then stimulating here. You can see, oh my gosh. And the calcium is then causing glutamate to be released from the vesicles into the synapse, and here they're binding to NMDA receptors. Over here is the most prominent type of nicotinic receptor in the human brain, the alpha 4 beta 2 subtype. It's believed to be the main receptor that mediates nicotine dependence. So in mice, if you knock out the beta 2 subunit gene, this eliminates the behavioral effects of nicotine. So the mice will no longer self-administrate nicotine and dopamine is no longer released. Some receptors are more sensitive to nicotine than others. Like this one here is much more sensitive to nicotine than those composed of all alpha 7 subunits. In one study, even a single puff of a cigarette led to occupancy of high affinity nicotine receptors measured 3 hours later. So super sensitive to nicotine. High agonist exposure, so in this case, nicotine, leads to what? What does it do to the receptors? That's right, desensitization. This means nicotine can decrease the effectiveness of normal cholinergic transmission. So really high doses of nicotine lead to persistent activation of nicotine receptors and therefore a continuous depolarization. This causes a depolarization block and the cell can't fire again until the nicotine is removed. So a high dose of nicotine exerts a biphasic effect. It begins with stimulation of nicotine cholinergic function, but then it turns to a blockage. Some nicotine receptors, particularly those containing alpha 7 subunits, are located presynaptically, so they enhance neurotransmitter release. So this means the secondary consequence of nicotine exposure is glutamate-mediated excitation. Besides glutamate, norepinephrine, ACH, serotonin, GABA, dopamine, and endorphins are all released as well, mediating various behaviors of nicotine. So we'll talk more about these later. But one really important one is dopamine release in the VTA, in the VTA to the nucleus accumbens. So does anyone remember what this pathway does? Right, drug-induced reward. There we go. Okay, on to metabolism. 70 to 80% of nicotine is transformed into the principal metabolite cotinine by a liver enzyme known as CYP2A6, which you can see here, nicotine cotinine. Cotinine and other nicotinic metabolites are excreted mainly through the urine, and elimination half-life is about 2 hours. Because of genetic variation, some individuals have low CYP2A6 activity and therefore reduced nicotine metabolism. Slow metabolizers smoke fewer cigarettes, and so they're less likely to become dependent. They also have greater success quitting. So how you metabolize nicotine is actually really important. And there's wide individual variability and as well as racial and gender differences in rate of nicotine metabolism. On average, Asians and African Americans metabolize nicotine slower than Caucasians or Hispanics, and the rate of nicotine metabolism is faster in women, even faster for women taking birth control, and even faster during pregnancy. Genetic variation of CYP2A6 may also influence the risk of smoking-induced cancer. Nicotine has a lot of varying effects, some good and some bad. Nicotine receptors are abundantly expressed in the autonomic ganglia, which leads to the physiological effects, both in the sympathetic and in the parasympathetic system, which obviously causes a wide spectrum of manifestations. For example, nicotine stimulates adrenal glands to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, which leads to physiological arousal. Do you all remember some of the effects of sympathetic activation? So if you said things like elevated blood pressure and tachycardia, which do we remember what this is? Right, increased heart rate. Then good job. Repeated exposure to nicotine alters the balance of the autonomic nervous system, which can lead to chronically elevated sympathetic activity. This is bad because it can increase risk of cardiovascular disease and strokes. Action on parasympathetic ganglia increases hydrochloric acid secretion in the stomach, which can contribute to formation of stomach ulcers. It also causes increased muscular contractions in the bowels, which sometimes leads to chronic diarrhea. So yeah, this sounds mostly negative. One unfortunate positive is the constraining effect on body weight, which obviously the dangers of smoking far outweigh possible weight loss. But the sad reality is that this was the primary reason for initiation of cigarette use in teenage girls. At least a study in the US in 2003 found this. So it's definitely like necessary to look at. Rat and human studies have shown that nicotine administration can decrease food intake and body weight, and this effect is even greater in females. Also, when people try to quit smoking, they often gain weight. The constraining effect on body weight is attributed to an increase in metabolic rate combined with appetite suppression. So, a group of ACH neurons within the basal forebrain strongly inhibit feeding behavior, and the effect of these cells is mediated partly through activation of nicotinic receptors. Another factor that contributes to this is oral stimulation. So, a lot of times people smoke instead of snacking. I am not sure who created these images, but there you go. We're not quite done with the adverse effects yet. Nicotine is technically a toxic substance, and so it can be fatal. 60 milligrams can be toxic to an adult, and cases do occur where people die from nicotine poisoning. Sometimes it's through swallowing tobacco, usually by a child, or e-cigarettes filled with high concentration of solutions, or, which I didn't know, absorption through the skin. The very first case reported was this florist who accidentally spilled a nicotine-containing insecticide on his chair, and he didn't realize it was toxic, and he died. So if you do get nicotine poisoning, you'll feel nauseous and experience things like excessive salivation, cold sweats, dizziness, and mental confusion, quickly followed by fainting. So left untreated, a fatal dose ends with convulsions, followed by respiratory failure due to depolarization, block of breathing muscles. So not good. In non-smokers, subcutaneous injections of a high dose of nicotine elicits various unpleasant reactions like nausea, dizziness, sweating, headaches, palpitations, stomach aches, and clammy hands. This reaction does not occur in smokers, which demonstrates chronic tolerance. What's interesting is that nicotine aversion has a genetic component, which I guess explains this image. It's related to a gene cluster on chromosome 15, and this chromosomal region encodes the genes for nicotinic receptor alpha 5, alpha 3, and beta 4. So activating receptors on these subunits enhances nicotine's aversive properties. On the other hand, knocking them out in mice enhances nicotine self-administration at really high doses, where the aversive effects would usually limit the animal's consumption. So clearly individuals are affected by nicotine really differently, and genetics plays a role in this. Unfortunately, even though there are all of these awful side effects, nicotine is highly reinforced in the brain. Among humans, tobacco is highly addictive. However, in animals, nicotine is less reinforcing than some other drugs of abuse, such as cocaine. Does anyone have any hypotheses as to why this could be? So we have a few answers. One is that tobacco is legal and access is almost universal, so there's just more of a chance of being exposed to it than other drugs. Along with this, there's probably lower stigma than other drugs. There are more than 4,000 constituents of tobacco smoke, so some of these other constituents besides nicotine may contribute. And nicotine has many effects on brain circuits and behavior in addition to just the reinforcement. We also use nicotine for a lot of complex reasons, as we discussed, besides just like the pleasure, like appetite control, helping with mood symptoms, and to focus on attention. This is a really cool diagram that shows the mechanism of action for drugs of abuse. So Over here, you see the VTA. Nicotine is binding directly to dopamine, and it's also binding to glutamate, which is then exciting more dopamine, and it also binds to the opioid receptors. So all of this contributes to addiction. So moving over here, we can see that dopamine is being excited in the nucleus accumbens. Reinforcement is one of the most important parts of understanding nicotine. So we're going to go into this further, but just keep this little diagram in mind. It does a really good job at showing the basic mechanisms. So nicotine by itself can be reinforcing, even without any of the behavioral components, as lab animals have demonstrated, since they'll self-administer pure nicotine with IV injections. But the strong reinforcing effects in humans are much more complicated. The degree of reinforcement can be influenced by a number of individual characteristics like sex and age. So females show greater nicotine reinforcement and reward than males and also have a harder time quitting. The same is true for adolescents compared to adults, which is hypothesized to stem from incomplete maturation of dopamine and other neurochemical systems. As we mentioned before, the mesolimbic DA pathway to the VTA to the nucleus accumbens plays a key role in nicotine's reinforcing effects. So this first image here is showing the VTA neuron firing rates. So we can see that adding nicotine causes them to like double. And the second picture shows that not only is the firing rate changing, but also the firing pattern. So when nicotine is added, a bunch of action potentials are fired as once, as you can see like from this clump right here. So both firing rate and pattern of firing are changed. Burst firing, like we're seeing down here, depends on excitatory synaptic inputs from glutamate. Glutamate activates high affinity nicotinic receptors located in the VTA, which stimulates burst firing of dopamine to the nucleus accumbens. Lesioning the dopamine innervations of the nucleus accumbens significantly stops nicotine self-administration in rats. This third picture over here is showing that increases in dopamine upon nicotine administration are dramatic. As you can see, like it spikes up and it stays up here for a few hours, and then it also drastically decreases. This pattern of dopamine encourages more use because the change is so dramatic and it doesn't feel good. Your body is like, all right, it's time for another spike. So that's why you often see like routine smoking breaks, because your body doesn't like these drastic changes. So also in chronic cigarette smokers, brain MAO activity is reduced. Do you all know what effect this would have? Remember that MAO breaks down dopamine and norepinephrine. Yeah, so this would increase levels of dopamine and norepinephrine in the synapses, also contributing to addictive behavior. And we see this in rats because inhibiting MAO helps them to learn to self-administer nicotine. So MAO inhibition interacts with nicotine to reinforce tobacco dependence. Besides the pharmacological actions of the drug, the user begins to associate specific moods, situations, and environmental factors with the rewarding effects. These associations become powerful cues for the urge to smoke, which is a type of conditioning. Unpleasant moods can become conditioned cues. A smoker may learn that not having a cigarette provokes irritability, and smoking a cigarette provides relief. After repeated experiences, the smoker may become to regard irritability from any source, such as stress or frustration, as a cue for smoking. Although conditioning becomes an important element of drug addiction, it only develops because of a pairing with the pharmacological actions of the drug with behaviors. It's been suggested that conditioning serves to maintain nicotine use during periods of desensitization of nicotine receptors, when there's a decrease in the biological response to nicotine. So when nicotine feels less good, it's the conditioning that keeps people smoking. But this rewarding relationship is constantly being renewed because after a period of abstinence, like during sleep, the receptors are sensitized again and the rewarding effects are reestablished and once again paired with the sensory stimuli of smoking. Because conditioning is such like a major factor in relapse, it's important to address for any kind of cessation therapy. 67% of nicotine users eventually become dependent, which is a crazy number. If you compare it to alcohol, it's only 22%, 21% for cocaine, and only 8% for cannabis. Twin studies have revealed that nicotine dependence, as well as the ability to quit, the symptoms experienced with withdrawal, and dependence are all highly heritable. Our textbook outlines two kinds of tolerance that contribute to dependence: acute and chronic. Acute tolerance is short-lived. Nicotine from even one cigarette is able to induce some degree of receptor desensitization. Just to refresh, what does desensitizing the receptor do? Right, it temporarily inactivates it. So after an overnight absence of nicotine, the smoker wakes up more sensitive to nicotine than at the end of the previous day because of this desensitization. And at the same time, the nicotine tolerance that built up over the previous day partially dissipates. So that's this drop over here. Because of this, the dependent individual wakes up with substantial craving for nicotine, but may also experience the strongest and the best response that they'll have all day. Chronic tolerance, on the other hand, is caused by long-term exposure to nicotine, and it's superimposed over this acute within a day tolerance. People who have become dependent must smoke repeatedly over the day to avoid withdrawal symptoms due to falling blood nicotine levels. Frequent smoking leads to ever-increasing peak levels of nicotine across the day, since each dose builds on the residual nicotine left over. So let's look at this graph. Looking at this squiggly line, the smoker has to keep smoking nicotine, otherwise it just keeps dropping. So they have to keep their plasma nicotine levels high enough to avoid these withdrawal symptoms, and they want to achieve the pleasure or the arousal. But then you see over here, like once they go to sleep, it falls again because they're no longer smoking. Smokers generally experience both acute and chronic tolerance. They're superimposed over each other, but this is just showing the overnight effects. Corticotropin releasing factor appears to be contributing to withdrawal. CRF is released in the central nucleus of the amygdala, and this is a common mechanism of negative affect manifestation. It also occurs with alcohol, cocaine, opiates, and cannabinoid addiction. There's also a decrease in brain reward functioning experienced during withdrawal. So in rat studies, this is measured by the threshold for intracranial electrical self-stimulation, which is impaired during withdrawal. That's a sign of anhedonia. What does this mean again? Hint, we talked about it in the ketamine study with bipolar disorder. It's reduced pleasure. Clearly, no one wants to experience this, and cigarettes temporarily alleviate the withdrawal symptoms, so this partially explains why quitting can be so hard. Much longer withdrawal that occurs when people try to quit smoking is called abstinence syndrome, and it's characterized by affective symptoms like anxiety and irritability, somatic symptoms like tremors and hunger, and cognitive, like difficulty concentrating and memory impairment. Approximately 80% of smokers who attempt to quit on their own relapse within the first months of abstinence. Studies of the biological basis for nicotine reinforcement has helped to design treatments for smoking cessation, but smokers report that they smoke for a lot of reasons, as we've discussed, so that makes it more difficult to come up with successful methods. There are currently 3 FDA-approved classes of medication for smoking cessation. One is nicotine replacement products, 2 is bupropion, and 3 is varenicline, I think. So the first is nicotine replacement therapy, and here, some shown over here. It's like the nicotine gum, patches, nasal spray. They act on receptors to mimic the effects of nicotine, which allows for the relief of the withdrawal symptoms, and also it provides positive reinforcement. So when the user has an urge to smoke, they can instantly dose themselves. This is most relevant for rapid delivery formulas like the nasal spray and to a lesser extent the gum. In one study, participants using nicotine gum still reported abstinence syndrome symptoms after a week of not smoking, but most of them were gone by the 4th week. However, 2/3 of them were back to smoking after a 6-month follow-up. So clearly, nicotine abstinence syndrome is not the only reason smokers find it hard to quit. Bupropion was marketed as an antidepressant before smoking cessation, but doctors noticed it was causing smoking cessation in veterans who were being treated for depression. They work by increasing brain levels of dopamine and norepinephrine, which causes the stimulating effects of nicotine. Varenicline is a partial agonist, while nicotine is a full agonist. So nicotine causes the substantial dopamine release. This medication produces less of a response than nicotine, but at the same time blocks the effects of any nicotine added to the system. There are also a lot of methods that are currently being looked into, but nothing that has been approved by the FDA yet. So one is called rimonabant, and this is a cannabinoid receptor antagonist that was developed for treating obesity. Cannabinoid receptors are believed to contribute to the reinforcing effects of nicotine action, but it hasn't been approved because of the concerns about neuropsychiatric effects. Another potential treatment that's undergoing clinical trials right now is nicotine vaccines. The vaccines cause the individual to develop antibodies to nicotine, and then these antibodies bind to nicotine and slow its entry to the brain, which reduces the reinforcing effects. Okay, so now you know how nicotine works, and we're going to talk a little bit about why this matters. Clearly, nicotine addiction has adverse effects, including premature death. So that's enough of a reason to be concerned. But in addition, it affects the population disproportionately. So tobacco addiction is much more common in people with mental health and substance abuse disorder. People with mental health and substance abuse disorders consume 44% of the cigarettes while in the US, while they're only representing 22% of the population. A lot of research has gone into trying to figure out why this is and if there are any answers to how we can help with this. But some of the reasons for why this could be is that nicotine can medicate some of the psychiatric symptoms people experience. For example, nicotine causes serotonin and norepinephrine release, like some antidepressants. It also acts on nicotinic receptors to improve sensory gating, which is abnormal in people with schizophrenia. And it inhibits MAO, which is used to treat depression sometimes. Also, constant nicotine exposure causes desensitization of nicotine receptors, which can result in stabilized mood. So it can improve depression. Additionally, the stimulant effects of nicotine can reduce unpleasant side effects of psychiatric medication and alcohol. This is super concerning because people with chronic illness die on average 25 years earlier. This is primarily due to cardiovascular disease and diabetes, which smoking definitely contributes to. Studies have also looked into shared genetic susceptibility to tobacco addiction and alcohol abuse with major depression. As of now, the direction of causality is still unclear, but what we do know is that smokers report increased feelings of anxiety and stress between cigarettes, and nicotine can alleviate the withdrawal symptoms. So the positive effects are only observed after abstinence when withdrawal-induced depression symptoms are high, which means that smokers may perceive a positive effect of smoking on mood because nicotine delivery counteracts the negative effects of withdrawal, but this may mask a longer-term increase in depression symptoms. There are also a lot of studies that implicate ACH with depression, as Tia briefly touched on. It's been suggested that a balance exists between cholinergic and norepinephrine systems, so that hyperactivation of cholinergic, like nicotine induces, could lead to or worsen depressive symptoms. Also in studies, administering a ACH antagonist, which increases ACH in the brain, to patients or healthy subjects results in negative effects on mood. From these observations, it was suggested that cholinergic hypersensitivity could represent a risk factor for the development of depression. Imaging studies have also shown that depressed patients have increased levels of choline, which is the precursor of ACH. And patients with depression have decreased brain nicotinic receptor availability, but without changing receptor number, which suggests an increase in endogenous ACH levels. Developmental exposure to tobacco smoke is another risk factor that increases the likelihood of adult smoking. Contribution of parental smoking to initiate tobacco use is likely to involve greater access to cigarettes, effects of socioeconomic status, and other social factors. Nicotine exposure during early development is a risk factor for stronger nicotine reinforcement later in life, which has been shown in both rats and human studies. In addition to increased risk of smoking, maternal smoking is associated with increased risk of ADHD in children. Children exposed to tobacco in utero show effects on the cortical connections, causing long-lasting changes in performance of auditory and other sensory attention tasks. So exposed children might use nicotine as an attempt to self-medicate these attentional deficits. So, what is the principal metabolite of nicotine? It's cotinine. Does nicotine activate the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system? Trick question, it's both. Do men or women tend to show greater nicotine reward and reinforcement? Women. What causes the reinforcing effects of nicotine? A. Dopamine release to nucleus accumbens. B. Reduction of brain MAOs. C. Conditioning of environmental factors and moods. Or D. All of the above. It's all of the above. And what is the long withdrawal from nicotine called when a person is attempting to quit? Abstinence syndrome. Which of the following is not an FDA-approved cessation treatment? A. Bupropion. B. Rimonabant. C. Nicotine replacement therapy. Or D. Varenicline. It's rimonabant. It is currently still being explored. Okay, now switching from my least favorite to my favorite drug. Caffeine is the principal psychoactive ingredient in coffee. Coffee beans are the seeds of the plant Coffea arabica, and here's the pretty picture from the textbook. Coffee is believed to have been discovered in Ethiopia around 850 BCE and then brought to Europe by Venetian merchants in 1650, and since then the consumption has rapidly spread. Now about 85% of the US population, excluding children younger than 2, consume at least one caffeinated beverage per day. The mean daily consumption is 165 milligrams. And here's just a fun little chart of how much caffeine you can find in your beverage. So you can see the average cup of coffee has about 108 milligrams. Coffee is absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract within 30 to 60 minutes. This process begins in the stomach, but takes place mainly in the small intestine. The average plasma half-life is 4 hours. So, as you can see from this little life cycle, if you drink a cup of coffee at 3 p.m., 50% of it will still be present at 7 p.m. That is why, as tired as I am, I will not be drinking coffee at this hour. People who drink coffee repeatedly throughout the day experience gradually rising plasma caffeine concentrations, and most of this caffeine is cleared from circulation during sleep. Caffeine is converted to a variety of metabolites by the liver, which are mostly eliminated through urine. Pregnant women metabolize coffee more slowly, so that's why they're supposed to limit caffeine intake. Now on to the receptors. Caffeine binds to adenosine receptors. Can you tell from the picture what kind of receptors these are? Yes, you should spy the G protein here and the second messenger cascade. So they're G protein coupled receptors. There are 4 subtypes, A1, A2A, A2B, and A3. A1 and A2A are responsible for mediating most of the adenosine effects in the brain. They're the major targets of caffeine. A1 is the predominant subtype in the cerebral cortex, hippocampus, and cerebellum. A2A is mostly found in the striatum and the olfactory bulb. One of the primary locations of these receptors are the dorsal striatum, the cauda putamen, and the ventral striatum, the nucleus accumbens. What neurotransmitter is the VTA rich in? Yes, dopamine. So this accounts for the stimulatory effects. The endogenous agonist is, unsurprisingly, adenosine. Adenosine comes from the breakdown of ATP, as this diagram here demonstrates. It is a key neurotransmitter in production of sleep. Studies on cats have shown that adenosine levels in the basal forebrain are significantly elevated during prolonged wakefulness. So caffeine blockade of adenosine receptors is especially beneficial for promoting wakefulness. In addition, adenosine levels rise in stress and tend to minimize the risk of adverse outcomes by increasing energy supply and decreasing cellular work. So when we're stressed, dopamine activity in both the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways are high, which are important for attention, working memory, and motivation to do stuff. When this happens, adenosine levels will also rise as a protective mechanism, and it prevents us from excitotoxicity. So if you've ever noticed, like when you're studying for a big exam and you're really stressed, you're hyperfunctioning for a while, but then adenosine binds and wears you out, so you crash. This stops you from studying yourself past exhaustion. But if you drink your caffeine, it blocks the adenosine receptors, so you can continue studying until you crash again. Caffeine has a number of cellular mechanisms, as you can see from our image. So here is 1 cup of coffee. In low doses, it causes stimulatory and slightly euphoric effects, but at higher doses, it is inhibitory and dysphoric. 1 or 2 cups of coffee only block adenosine receptors, and this is like the therapeutic index. And drinking more caffeine leads to more adenosine receptors being blocked, but it also leads to other mechanisms that lead to these adverse effects. So as you can see, now we also have calcium being stimulated and GABA A receptors blocked, as well as phosphodiesterases inhibited. So these are the effects that underlie the irritable and toxic effects of caffeine. All right, if you've made it this far, thank you. We are on to our final review. How long is caffeine's half-life? 4 hours. And where does adenosine come from? Breakdown of ATP. What does consumption of caffeine do to adenosine receptors? It blocks them. Caffeine is an antagonist, so it blocks adenosine receptors, promoting wakefulness and arousal. And you have made it through our lecture on caffeine and nicotine. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm excited to discuss the article with you all tomorrow.